I thought we were simply having a nice family dinner. My daughter Claire had called me that Tuesday morning with that warm, slightly breathless voice she gets when she is genuinely excited about something, or when she wants me to believe she is. And she said, "Mom, Daniel and I want to take you out tonight, somewhere really special, just the three of us." I remember asking what we were celebrating, and she laughed and said, Just you, Mom. You deserve a treat." I dressed in my good blue blouse with the pearl buttons, the one Harold always said brought out the color in my eyes, pinned my silver hair into the low, careful roll he used to call my elegant look, and I walked through the glass doors of Bellagio's, the most famous restaurant in all of Hartfield, the kind of place where you need a reservation 3 weeks in advance, and the butter arrives sculpted into the shape of roses, feeling grateful and a little proud and entirely catastrophically blind to what was actually happening that evening. The waiter, who changed everything, leaned down beside my chair the moment Claire excused herself to the restroom, and Daniel's attention had dropped to his phone, and he spoke in a voice so quiet that I had to hold perfectly still to catch the words, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your son-in-law made a phone call from the bar when your party first arrived, and I heard him say that you'd be here for at least 2 hours, and that the documents would be ready at the house." And then, 11 minutes after that, while I sat with a glass of Chardonnay, I could no longer bring myself to drink, and a plate of salmon I had ceased to see, 2 police officers walked through the front door of Bellagio's, and the sommelier froze mid-pour, and the couple at the next table went immediately silent, and both officers moved directly, not toward the bar, not toward the maitre d', not toward anyone else in that softly lit and suddenly airless room, but toward me. I had lived in the house on Maple Crest Drive for 41 years. Harold and I had moved in 3 weeks before our first wedding anniversary, in the October of a year when the maples were already turning, and the air smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves, and all the ordinary promise of a life being assembled, piece by piece. The house had been modest even then, a 2-story craftsman with a wide porch and a south-facing garden that Harold immediately decided was perfect for roses, over my protestations that neither of us knew anything about roses, and over his counter-protestations that neither of us had known anything about marriage either, and we were doing all right at that. He was right, as he was right about most things, and the roses came in beautifully the second spring, and by the time Claire was born, the garden was Harold's great pride, and the house was, in the way that houses become after enough years of living, not just a structure, but a kind of accumulated self, layered with the specific weight of everything that had happened inside it. Harold died 3 years ago in February, quietly, in the way he had done most things. The house became very large after that. Claire worried about me there alone, which was natural and loving, and I told her I wasn't alone in any way that mattered, that I had 41 years of company in those rooms, and she smiled the way she smiled when she thought I was being slightly sentimental, and was too kind to say so. I kept the garden. I retired from teaching the year before Harold passed, and I filled the mornings with the roses, and the afternoons with books, and the evenings with the kind of comfortable solitude that is only peaceful if you have genuinely loved your life. And I had. The house was paid off entirely. I had Harold's modest pension, my own teacher's pension, a small savings account. I was not wealthy by any particular measure, but I was not struggling, and I was exactly where I wanted to be, in the rooms where my life had happened, with the pencil marks still on the kitchen door frame from every year of Claire's childhood height, the last one in Harold's handwriting from the year she stopped growing. I knew that the house had gone up significantly in value. The neighborhood had changed in the last decade. The old families had been gradually replaced by young professionals, and the coffee shops had multiplied, and a small boutique hotel had opened on the corner, and the property values had risen accordingly, the way a tide raises all the boats in the harbor, whether they want to be raised or not. An unsolicited letter from a real estate agency, 6 months before that November dinner, had estimated the market value of 14 Maple Crest Drive at $385,000. I had filed it in the kitchen drawer with the elastic bands and the spare batteries and the old green address book that still had Harold's handwriting in it, and I had not thought very much about it. I was not planning to sell. The idea had not once occurred to me as a serious possibility. My house was not a financial instrument. It was my house. Daniel Marsh, however, saw things differently. He had always seen houses differently. He worked in real estate development, not in any particularly large way, not as someone you would read about in a business journal, but in the quiet, transactional way of a man who understands what properties are worth, and who has, over time, developed the practiced eye of someone who looks at a building and sees primarily its conversion potential. He had the kind of manner that passes for charm in professional contexts, attentive, well-dressed, Unhurried, the sort of man who asks questions and listens to the answers with an expression of focused interest that you only later understand was not genuine interest, but rather data collection. He'd been asking about the house for months. I understood this in retrospect with a clarity that was almost comically obvious. How had I not seen it? But in the moment, each individual observation had seemed harmless enough that I had not assembled them into a pattern. It had started at Easter lunch, when Daniel mentioned, as though it were a casual observation rather than the first move in a carefully thought-through game, that the Maple Crest neighborhood was really coming into its own. Then at Claire's birthday dinner in June, when he asked, with the gentle, solicitous air of a man expressing familial concern, whether I had ever thought about downsizing, whether managing a property this size on my own wasn't becoming a burden, whether there were perhaps other living situations that might suit me better. Something with less maintenance, he'd said, cutting his steak. A nice apartment, somewhere close to Claire. Have you thought about it, Ruth? Just as a practical consideration. I had said I hadn't thought about it, and that I wasn't planning to, and he had nodded with the expression of a man who has registered an answer and filed it for future use. Claire had been quiet during this conversation. I had noticed her quietness and interpreted it as simple discomfort at the topic. Her father's house, her childhood home. It was natural that she wouldn't want to hear it discussed in those terms. I had not interpreted it as foreknowledge. My neighbor Betty had said something to me in September. Betty Hoffman, who had lived next door for 22 years and who possessed the particular knowledge of long proximity. She knew where I kept my spare key. She knew how I took my tea. She knew that I talked to Harold in the garden in the mornings, and she had never once made anything of it. In September, she stopped me at the mailbox and said she had seen a man with a clipboard standing outside my house the previous Thursday while I was at my book club. He had walked the perimeter of the garden, she said. He had stood on the pavement and looked at the roofline. He had taken what looked like photographs on his phone. She had written down the license plate number of his car, because Betty was that kind of person. Not suspicious by nature, but attentive by practice. The kind of neighbor who notices what other people decide isn't worth noticing. She handed me the folded piece of paper and said, "Probably nothing, but I thought you should know." I had thanked her and put the paper in my coat pocket and told her it was probably a surveyor or perhaps someone from the council doing routine assessments, and she had given me the particular look, a slight narrowing, a measured pause, that she deployed when she disagreed with something but had decided not to press it. I had forgotten about the paper by the time I got inside. Daniel had also become slightly strange in October. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have registered as alarming in isolation, but he had stopped asking about the house directly and started asking adjacent questions instead. Whether my roof insurance was up to date, whether I had reviewed my will recently, whether I had ever thought about giving Claire a lasting power of attorney, just in case, the way sensible people did as they got older. "Not that there's any urgency," he'd said with the smile of a man who has learned to attach reassurance to every potentially alarming statement. "Just for peace of mind, really. We worry about you, Ruth." And I had smiled back and said I was perfectly fine and that I had a solicitor who handled that sort of thing if it ever became relevant, and the conversation had moved on, and I had not thought about it again until I was sitting at Harold's kitchen table looking at a forged, durable power of attorney that bore my name in a signature that was almost mine but was not. The call from Claire had come on a Tuesday morning in November, 11 months after Daniel had first suggested, with his Easter lunch casual air, that the neighborhood was coming into its own. She called at 9:30, which was slightly earlier than she normally called, but not so early as to be unusual. She sounded warm and bright and certain, and she said, "Mom, we're taking you out tonight. Bellagio's, the proper reservation, the whole thing. You deserve it. Just say you'll come." I said of course I'd come. I was delighted. I remember the specific sensation of being pleased, a warmth behind the sternum, the particular happiness of a woman who lives alone and loves her solitude, but also loves, very much, the company of the daughter she raised and the man her daughter married, or the man she thought her daughter had married. I put on my good blue blouse with the pearl buttons, and I pinned my silver hair, and I went. Bellagio's was everything it always had been. White tablecloths and real crystal and soft lighting, and the sommelier who glided between tables with the authority of someone who knows more about wine than you ever will, and is gracious enough not to make you feel bad about it. We were given the best table, the one by the window with the view of the little fountain in the square outside. It was a cold night, and the fountain was lit, and the water caught the light in a way that was genuinely lovely. I ordered salmon. Daniel ordered a steak and a bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent on a week's groceries. Claire looked beautiful. She had worn the green dress I had always loved on her, the one that matched the particular shade of her eyes, and she was smiling, and for the first 20 minutes everything felt exactly like what she had told me it was. A treat, a family dinner, an unremarkable Tuesday, made briefly extraordinary by a good restaurant and good company. I noticed the phone twice. Daniel checked it during the appetizer course, both times tilting the screen slightly away from the table before setting it face down. The first time I registered it as the habitual distraction of a man who is always half elsewhere. The second time, I felt a faint, sourceless unease that I dismissed before it had fully formed. Claire was asking me about the roses. Had the late frost done the damage I'd worried about? Had the new feed I'd been using helped with the black spot on the climber along the back wall? And I was answering, and the questions kept coming, one after another, so that the conversation was always moving and always about me, and always pointing away from both of them, and I was talking and enjoying the talking, and not noticing that this was by design. Daniel excused himself before the main course arrived. He said he needed to make a quick call. Client in a different time zone. Couldn't be helped. He'd be 2 minutes. He went to the bar. He was not 2 minutes. He was closer to 8. But by the time he returned, the food had arrived and we moved on, and I didn't dwell on it. He was a man who worked in real estate development. Men who worked in real estate development made phone calls at inconvenient times. This was not new information. The waiter came during the main course, in the window between Claire going to the restroom and Daniel being absorbed by whatever was on his phone. He was perhaps 25, dark-haired, with a composed, careful face and the specific bearing of a young man who has learned to move quietly and efficiently through a room full of people who are not paying attention to him. He bent toward me with the practiced lean of someone delivering a wine recommendation, and he spoke so quietly that the table beside us could not possibly have heard a word, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to do this here. I was working the bar about 40 minutes ago when your party arrived, and your son-in-law made a phone call before he came to the table. I overheard him tell someone that you were here, that you'd have at least 2 hours, and he said something about documents being ready at the house." He paused. He had careful eyes that looked at me with the direct, serious attention of someone who has made a decision and is going to carry it through. He said, "I don't know what it means, but I have a grandmother." I couldn't not say something. Then he straightened up, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked away, and I was alone with a plate of salmon that had ceased to exist for me, and a crystal glass of Chardonnay that I set down with the extreme deliberateness of someone who is trying very hard not to break something. My hands. I will tell you about my hands. They went cold first, starting at the fingertips and moving inward, and then they went absolutely still, which is not the same as calm, which is rather the stillness of a system that has received information it cannot yet process and has defaulted to the most basic possible state while it tries. I thought, documents. I thought, the house. I thought about Daniel and his Easter lunch conversation about the neighborhood coming into its own. I thought about his June birthday dinner question about downsizing. I thought about his October question about lasting power of attorney, just for peace of mind, Ruth. I thought about the man with the clipboard and Betty's folded piece of paper with the license plate number written in Betty's precise, unhurried handwriting. I was still sitting exactly as I had been when Claire came back from the restroom, and she sat down and looked at me and said, "Are you all right, Mom? You look." And I said, "I'm fine. I'm just a little warm." And I watched her eyes, and something moved in them, a flicker, a caught breath of something. And I thought, she knows. I did not know yet precisely what she knew, or how much, or how long she had known it. But in that moment, watching her face rearrange itself back into an expression of pleasant concern, I understood that whatever was happening had not been kept entirely from her. And then Daniel came back to the table, and I watched him look at me, and I watched him look at his phone one more time, and I watched him pour himself a glass of wine with the easy, unhurried movement of a man who has a plan and believes the plan is running on schedule. And I sat with what I knew, which was not yet everything, but was already more than enough. And I waited. I did not have to wait long. 11 minutes later, the 2 officers walked in. Their names were Officer Reyes and Officer Calloway. I know this because I asked afterward when there was time to ask things. Officer Reyes was a woman in her mid-30s with a level, steady voice and the kind of composed face that has learned to walk into rooms with unpredictable contents and show nothing in advance. Officer Calloway was taller, quieter, the kind of person who observes more than he speaks. They spoke briefly to the maitre d', who glanced, and there it was, that glance toward our table, and I saw it before either Claire or Daniel did, and I watched the knowledge travel across Daniel's face a fraction of a second after it landed on mine. They walked directly to our table. Not to anyone else, to me. "Mrs. Patterson?" Officer Reyes said. "Ruth Patterson?" I said yes. She said, "Ma'am, your neighbor, a Mrs. Betty Hoffman, called our dispatch approximately 40 minutes ago. She reported 2 unknown individuals entering your property on Maple Crest Drive using what appeared to be a key, and they have been inside since that time. She's currently at the scene. We thought it was important to locate you before proceeding." She spoke calmly, as people who deliver difficult information professionally learn to speak. The crystal in my hand was still warm from where I'd been holding it. I set it down. I looked at Daniel. He had gone the color of old chalk. Not white exactly, but drained, flattened. A man from whom the blood has moved elsewhere to deal with a more pressing emergency. He was looking at me. I was looking at him. Between us, the salmon and the wine and the hand-shaped butter roses sat in their incongruous normalcy, absurd in the way that ordinary things become absurd when placed beside extraordinary ones. I said, "Let's go." The drive to Maple Crest Drive was 9 minutes. I know because I counted the seconds, not as any deliberate technique of self-management, but because my mind, in the absence of coherent thought, had defaulted to the simplest possible measurement of time continuing to pass. 1, 2, 3. Daniel drove because I was in no condition to operate a vehicle, and I sat in the back, and Officer Reyes and Officer Calloway followed us in their patrol car, and Claire sat in the passenger seat in a silence so complete and so specific that it was its own kind of information. At the 5-minute mark, she said, in a voice I had never heard from her before, small and constricted, as though she was speaking through a very narrow opening, "Mom, it's probably nothing." I did not answer. I looked at the back of Daniel's head, the set of his shoulders, the tendons in his neck, visible above the collar of his shirt. I thought about all the Sunday lunches at which I had sat across from that neck and that collar and passed the bread basket and talked about harmless things, and I thought about how extraordinarily ordinary a man can be made to seem when you are looking at him through the lens of loving the person who loves him. Betty was standing on my front path when we arrived. She was wearing the gray wool cardigan she wore regardless of temperature, arms crossed over her chest, and even from the car I could see the particular set of her face, the expression she used when she had been vindicated about something she wished she hadn't been right about. The front living room light was on. Through the window I could see the shadow of movement inside my house. There was a white sedan parked at the curb that I did not recognize. I got out of the car and my legs held, which surprised me. I walked up the path and Betty looked at me and she said, "2 men went in about an hour ago. One of them had a key." I turned to Daniel. I said very quietly, "Who has a key to my house?" He said, and these were the first words he had spoken since the restaurant, "Ruth, let's go inside and deal with this calmly." He did not answer the question. I noted that he did not answer the question. Men like Daniel are very good at not answering questions, not through obvious evasion, which would be too legible, but through redirection, through the re-establishment of tone, through the gentle practiced suggestion that the question itself is somehow the problem. "Calmly," he had said, as though my calm were the variable most in need of management at that moment. The 2 men inside my house were a Mr. Gregory Tulane and a notary public named Sandra Cole. Gregory Tulane was in his mid-50s, thinning brown hair, the specific kind of well-maintained blandness that belongs to men who have learned to be professionally forgettable. He was a real estate transaction specialist, a category of credential that occupies a gray zone between the legally qualified and the legally adjacent, the kind of expertise that is most useful in situations where all parties are, for various reasons, motivated not to ask too many questions. He was sitting at my kitchen table, Harold's kitchen table, the one with the ring mark from the coffee pot, the mark I could never quite remove and had eventually stopped trying to remove because it was Harold's mark, and I was not interested in erasing Harold's marks. Gregory Tulane was sitting at that table with a manila folder open in front of him and several documents laid out in a precise, deliberate row. And Sandra Cole, the notary, was sitting beside him with her stamp and her pen, and when the police officers came through the door behind me, her face performed a very rapid journey from professional neutrality to unmistakable alarm. "What is this?" I said. My voice, when I heard it, sounded strange to me. Too level, too measured, like a recording of myself rather than my actual voice, played back at the correct speed, but without the full range of frequency. I walked to the table. Gregory Tulane began to rise and began to speak, and Officer Calloway raised one hand and said simply, "Please stay seated, sir." and Tulane sat back down with the controlled compliance of a man who has decided that a cooperative posture is the remaining viable option. I looked at the documents on the table. The first was a durable power of attorney. It bore my full name, Ruth Eleanor Patterson, in the designated grantor field. It bore Daniel Marsh's name as the designated attorney in fact. It was dated 3 weeks prior, and in the signature line where I should have signed, in my own hand, on a day 3 weeks ago that I did not remember, and could not have remembered because it had not happened, was a signature. It looked like mine. It had the general shape and rhythm of my signature, the way a good photograph of a person looks like them while somehow failing to be them. I could see, in the loop of the capital R and in the angle of the T in Patterson, the specific way it was not my signature while trying very hard to be. Small things, almost invisible things, the things that only reveal themselves when you know to look, and I knew to look because I had signed my own name for 67 years, and I knew what it felt like from the inside. The second document was a real estate purchase agreement. The property at 14 Maple Crest Drive. My house, Harold's house, the house where Claire had taken her first steps, and where we had marked every year of her height on the kitchen door frame in pencil and never painted over the marks, even when we repainted everything else, was listed for sale to a corporate buyer named Meridian Property Holdings, LLC. The agreed purchase price was $265,000. The current market value, as I happen to know from the unsolicited appraisal letter filed in my kitchen drawer with the elastic bands and the spare batteries, was $385,000. Someone had agreed to sell my house for $120,000, less than it was worth, using my forged signature, while I was eating salmon at Bellagio's 2 miles away. I do not remember sitting down. I became aware at some point that I was sitting in my kitchen chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that rocks if you shift your weight to the left, and Betty had her hand on my shoulder, and the police were speaking to Gregory Tulane in the careful, escalating tones of people who have found something considerably more significant than they anticipated, and Daniel was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway with his hands in his pockets. I looked at his hands. They were very still in his pockets, the stillness of someone who is running calculations very rapidly behind a controlled exterior. Claire was not in the room. I looked toward the kitchen window and I could see her through the glass, standing on the front path, arms wrapped around herself, not looking at the house. Daniel. When I said his name, it came out very quietly. He had to take a step forward to hear me. He stepped forward. I waited until he was close enough that I could see his eyes without having to raise my voice, and I said, "You forged my signature." He opened his mouth, and I said, "Don't." He closed his mouth. I said, "You forged my signature. You hired this man and this notary to come to my house while you kept me occupied in a restaurant. You were going to sell my house, Harold's house, the house where your wife was born, the house where she learned to walk, to a company I have never heard of for $120,000 less than it is worth, and you were planning to do this without my knowledge or my consent." Each sentence came out separately, clearly, evenly, in the way that words come out when you have moved beyond the range where emotion is the appropriate response. Or rather, when emotion has become so large and so complete that it has passed through the recognizable registers entirely and come out the other side as something cold and precise and very steady. He said, "Ruth, this is not..." And I said, "Who is Meridian Property Holdings?" The question fell between us like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples move across his face. He looked at the table. He looked at the documents. He looked at Gregory Tulane, who was now speaking quietly to Officer Reyes with the deliberate, voluntary cooperation of a man securing his own best outcome. And then Daniel looked at me, and whatever he had been wearing, the reasonable son-in-law face, the concerned family member face, the "I just want what's best for everyone" face, came off. Not dramatically, not in a single gesture or outburst. It simply subtracted itself, and what was underneath was tired and cold and more truthful than anything I had seen from him in 9 years of Sunday lunches and holiday tables and conversations at which I had passed him the bread basket and thought, "This is a good man who loves my daughter." He said, "You're 67 years old, Ruth. You live alone. You can't properly maintain a property this size, and the estate taxes alone are..." I said, "You were going to pocket the difference between the sale price and the market value." He didn't answer. I said, "Meridian Property Holdings is your company." Silence. Long enough that Officer Reyes turned from Gregory Tulane and looked at Daniel steadily. And then he said, very quietly, "It's a legitimate business entity." I said, with the quietness of absolute certainty, "Get out of my house." He didn't move immediately. Men who are accustomed to managing situations do not move immediately when told to do something they have not yet decided to accept. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and I could see him completing his calculation. The police, the documents, the notary who had clearly repositioned herself as witness rather than participant. The fact that Gregory Tulane was talking with the steady fluency of someone who is determined that cooperation is the price of leniency. And then he turned and walked through my hall and out through my front door. And I heard his footsteps on the path, and I heard him say something to Claire in a low, urgent voice, and I heard Claire make a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry, and then I heard a car door, and then I heard nothing but the sound of the police and Betty and the kitchen clock ticking, and the house, Harold's house, sitting around me in the specific alive quiet of a structure that has held 41 years of living and does not intend to be parted with it. Betty made tea. This is the thing I remember most vividly about the following hour. Betty moving around my kitchen with the precise, unhurried competence of a woman who knows where everything is kept, because 22 years of neighborliness is its own kind of intimacy. She found the kettle, the mugs, my green mug with the chip on the handle that I have been meaning to replace for 3 years and cannot bring myself to throw away. She moved the documents off the center of the table at Officer Reyes's direction. "Please don't touch them, Mrs. Patterson, they're evidence." And she put the tea down and she sat across from me and she put both hands flat on the table, in the way that Betty does when she is offering solidity without sentiment. And neither of us said anything for a while, and the clock ticked, and outside a car passed on the street, and somewhere up the hill someone was still living their ordinary Tuesday evening, entirely unaware that in the kitchen of 14 Maple Crest Drive, the bones of a family had just been laid out on Harold's table, with a ring mark on it. Officer Reyes told me that a detective would be in contact within 48 hours, and that in the meantime, the documents would be collected as evidence and a preliminary report filed. She gave me her card. She spoke carefully, without drama, in the manner of someone who has delivered bad news often enough to understand that clarity is more useful than comfort. Before she left, she said, "Mrs. Patterson, do you know of any previous instances in which Mr. Marsh may have inquired about your property, approached attorneys or agents, or expressed interest in acquiring or managing it?" I said yes. I told her about the conversations. I told her about Easter and June and October. I told her about the man with the clipboard. I told her about Betty's license plate number, still in my coat pocket since September. She wrote it all down. She said it was helpful. She said it with a particular neutrality that told me it was more than helpful. That it was, in fact, exactly the kind of corroborating timeline that turns an isolated incident into a demonstrable pattern. When they were gone, I sat for a while longer, and then I thought of something. And I went to the kitchen drawer, the one with the elastic bands and the spare batteries, and I took out the old green address book with the elastic band around it. Harold's handwriting was inside, still and permanent, the particular small, careful script of a man who had been precise about things. I found the name I was looking for in the M's. Martin Holloway, Harold's oldest friend, a retired attorney who had handled our affairs for 30 years, who had been at Harold's funeral with his quiet, formal dignity, who had taken my hand and said, "Harold made me promise I would say this to you. If you ever need anything at all, call me." I had never called. I dialed the number now. He answered on the third ring. It was nearly 9:30 in the evening, and he answered on the third ring, and I told him what had happened, and the brief, contained sound he made, an exhalation, a short pause, told me that this was not entirely news to him. I said, "Martin, why aren't you surprised?" He said, very carefully, "About 6 weeks ago, I received an inquiry from a man claiming to be acting on your behalf, asking about the terms of your property title, about whether a power of attorney would be legally sufficient to execute a residential sale without the principal's physical presence at every stage. He asked about your specific situation, a sole elderly owner, no co-title holder since Harold's passing." He paused. He gave his name as Tulane. Gregory Tulane. 6 weeks before the dinner at Bellagio's, Gregory Tulane had called Harold's attorney to map the legal landscape. This had been methodical, researched, the kind of preparation that does not happen on impulse or in the heat of a bad decision. It happens over months, with planning, with the specific cold patience of a man who is in no hurry because he believes he is going to win. 6 weeks of advance reconnaissance, and during those 6 weeks I had sat at dinner with Daniel and Claire and talked about my garden and my roses and the chimney that might need looking at before winter, and not once had I been anywhere close to understanding what was actually being assembled around me. Martin said he hadn't given Tulane anything useful, that he had attempted to verify Tulane's credentials afterward and found the callback number disconnected, that he should have called me then, and he was sorry he hadn't. I told him it was all right. He told me not to touch anything, to keep the copies Officer Reyes had left me secure, and to call him first thing in the morning. He said there were likely criminal charges, forgery at minimum, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud depending on what the investigation revealed about Meridian property holdings, and Daniel's involvement at each stage. He said it with the quiet precision of a man who is angry but has learned to be useful rather than expressive in his anger. And I was grateful to him for it, and I said goodnight. And I held the phone in my lap for a moment after the call ended, and I looked at Harold's handwriting in the address book, and I thought, you knew. You knew I might need him. You were 3 years gone and still taking care of things. Claire came to the door at 11:15. I saw her headlights through the front window, and I felt the particular compression in my chest that her name has always produced. Love and grief and fury, all pressed together into a sensation that has no single word for it in any language I know. I opened the door before she knocked. She was standing on the step in her green dress with her coat pulled tight and her mascara smudged in the specific way of a woman who has been crying in a car and arrived too soon to have put herself entirely back together. She was 38 years old, and she looked, standing there in the porch light, considerably younger than that. She looked the age she had been on the kitchen floor the morning after Harold died, when she had cried in the way that adult daughters cry when their fathers are gone and there is nothing that helps. And I had sat on the floor beside her, and we had stayed there together for a long time. I had thought then that there was nothing between us that could not be sat through on the floor together. I was discovering now that I had been wrong about the boundaries of that. She said, "Mom." I said, "Come in." Not warmly, not coldly, simply, a factual invitation. She came in, and I closed the door, and we stood in the hall, and she said, "I didn't know he was going to do it tonight." I heard this sentence very carefully. I said, "But you knew he was going to do it." She looked at the hallway floor. She said, "He told me it was just exploring options, that you'd be better off in something smaller, that the house was too much for one person to manage, and that if he could set up a sale, it would take the burden off you, and that he would present it to you properly once everything was arranged." Her voice was steady until the last few words, and then it wasn't. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. Then she said, "I didn't know about the signature, Mom. I promise you I didn't know he was going to forge it." I looked at my daughter. I thought about the birthday dinner and the way she had steered conversations toward me and away from them. I thought about her visit in March when she had walked through every room of the house while I made tea, and I had watched her through the kitchen window standing in Harold's study for a moment, her hand on the doorframe, and I had thought she was simply being nostalgic. I thought about all the gentle questions. "How are the roses, Mom? Do you find it lonely, Mom? Have you thought about the long term, Mom?" Questions I had answered happily and entirely, and which I understood now had been the information gathering of someone who was not entirely sure whether she was on my side or his. I said, "You knew he was making inquiries about selling the house. You knew he was planning to handle it without my direct involvement, and you said nothing to me." She didn't answer. The silence answered. I said, "Claire, he forged my signature. He hired professionals to come to your father's house while he kept me occupied at a restaurant. He intended to sell this house for considerably less than it is worth to a company that he himself owns and present it to me afterward as something he had arranged for my benefit." I paused. "How long has he been planning this?" She said very quietly, "About 8 months." I looked at the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame. Age 3, age 4, age 5, in Harold's handwriting up through the last mark at 17, the year she stopped growing. 8 months ago, Daniel had begun planning to take the place where those marks lived. 8 months of Sunday lunches and holiday conversations and passed bread baskets. I said, "I need you to go home tonight, Claire. I love you. I don't want to say something tonight that I can't take back, so please go home." She started to speak, and I said, "Please." And she looked at my face, and she went. Betty had heard all of it from the hallway. She came back to the kitchen without commenting on any of it, refilled the kettle, and sat down across the table from me. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to not be alone tonight." She said, "I'll get my things." And she went out through the back door to her own house, and I heard her back door latch, and the kitchen clock ticked, and the roses along the south fence moved in the November wind beyond the window, and I sat in Harold's house at Harold's table and thought about what came next. What came next was not the cinematic confrontation I might have imagined, in the abstract, when I imagined confrontations of this kind. What came next was methodical and careful and took weeks. Martin Holloway arranged for a forensic document examiner named Dr. Claudia Marsh, no relation, to review the power of attorney, and she confirmed in writing what I had seen immediately. The signature was a forgery, skilled but not expert, detectable under proper examination. The specific tells were in the capital R and the cross-stroke of the final T. She had seen better forgeries, she said, but not by a great margin. Gregory Tulane, interviewed by Detective Sayers, the detective assigned to my case, a quiet, thorough woman who reminded me of a more tired version of Betty, chose to cooperate fully and completely from the first conversation onward. He had saved emails. He had saved text messages. He had kept a folder, in the specific way of a man who has done this work long enough to know that a paper trail is simultaneously the greatest liability and potentially the greatest asset he possesses. This is what Gregory Tulane's cooperation revealed. Daniel had done this before, not to me, to a woman named Joanna Ferris, who had been his partner 5 years before he met Claire, and who had owned a small commercial property in the neighboring town of Whitmore. The details were different. A different mechanism, a different set of documents, a different configuration of names and companies. But the architecture was identical. A patient, methodical accumulation of access and trust, followed by a precisely timed execution while the target was elsewhere. Joanna had reported it. There had been an investigation. There had not been charges because of a jurisdictional technicality regarding the particular form of the property title and the specific nature of the documents involved, and because Joanna had not had a Martin Holloway or a Detective Sayers, and because Gregory Tulane had not been involved in that transaction, and therefore there was no paper trail with multiple corroborating voices. But it was there in the records, and Detective Sayers found it in a matter of days, because Detective Sayers was the kind of detective who looked for the thing before the first thing. Meridian Property Holdings. LC was confirmed to be Daniel's company within a week of the investigation beginning. He was the sole registered member, operating through a parent company that itself traced through 2 layers of incorporation before arriving, clearly and undeniably, at his name. The agreed purchase price of $265,000 had been structured to provide Meridian, which is to say Daniel, with a profit of $120,000 over the sum he intended to present to me as fair value, because he had already arranged a resale to a residential property developer who had expressed interest in the Maple Crest lot for a small infill project. The email chain between Daniel and the developer was recovered during discovery. Tulane had saved it. He had saved it knowing he might one day need it, and he had been correct. Detective Sayers called me on a Thursday morning 2 weeks after the dinner at Bellagio's. She said, "Mrs. Patterson, I want to update you on the progress of the investigation." She spoke in the level, undramatized way of someone who delivers significant information as a professional routine rather than a performance. She told me what they had found. She told me about Joanna Ferris. She told me about the developer and the resale arrangement. She told me about the emails, and then she said, "We'll be making an arrest today." I was in the garden when she called, pulling the last of the dead growth from the rose beds along the south fence, preparing them for winter the way Harold had always prepared them, the way he had taught me to prepare them in the second year after we moved in, when the roses were just beginning, and neither of us yet knew what they would become. I thanked Detective Sayers. I said it very quietly, and I meant it in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not just gratitude for the investigation, but for the particular seriousness with which she had treated a 67-year-old widow standing in her own kitchen with forged documents on her own kitchen table, the seriousness that says, "This matters, you matter, what was done to you is real and it has consequences." I needed that. I had not known before that moment precisely how much I had needed someone to say it. Daniel was arrested that Thursday morning. The charges were forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He was released on bail by the afternoon, but the conditions required him to surrender his passport, and there was something about that specific detail, the passport, the closed door of any easy exit, that settled something in me that had been unsettled since the night in the restaurant. He could not go anywhere. The law had him in a room and was not going to let him out of it until it had finished with him. It was not everything, and it was not fast, and it was not neat in the way that only fiction is neat, but it was real, and it was happening. And it was happening because a young waiter named Marcus had a grandmother and had chosen to say something instead of nothing, and because Betty Hoffman had written down a license plate number in September and given me a folded piece of paper that I had put in my pocket and almost forgotten. I went to see Joanna Ferris in December. Detective Sayers had passed my contact information to Joanna's attorney with Joanna's consent, and Joanna had written to me, a brief letter, handwritten, careful, saying she was glad someone had stopped it, that she had not been able to, and asking if I would be willing to meet. I drove to Whitmore on a Wednesday afternoon, a cold gray day, and we sat in a coffee shop and we talked for 2 hours. She was 41, dark-haired, with the specific quiet of someone who has survived something and has spent years deciding what to make of the survival. She told me about the property in Whitmore. She told me about the investigation that had gone nowhere. She told me about the particular experience of being in a room with someone you trusted absolutely and realizing in the space between one breath and the next that the trust had been used as a tool against you. That your willingness to believe the best of him had been the precise mechanism by which he had nearly taken everything. We talked for 2 hours, and at the end of it, she said very simply, "Thank you for not letting it go. I couldn't, and I've always wondered whether that was my fault." I told her it was not. I told her that the fault belonged entirely to the man who had done it, and that the absence of charges the first time was a failure of the legal system and not a reflection of anything she had or hadn't done. She nodded. She didn't cry, which I had the sense was a deliberate choice. The choice of someone who has done their crying in private and is no longer willing to do it in public for anyone, which I understood and respected completely. We shook hands when we parted. It was a small exchange in a gray December afternoon in a coffee shop in Whitmore, and it felt like something that mattered. 2 women who had been separately lied to, separately nearly stolen from, sitting in the same room and acknowledging the shared shape of what had been done. Daniel entered a guilty plea to 2 of the 3 charges 7 months after the arrest, 1 week before the trial was scheduled to begin. His legal team had, by that point, reviewed the weight of the evidence. The forensic document examination, Gregory Tulane's complete and detailed cooperation, the email chain with the developer, the Whitmore records, Betty's license plate number, which had been traced to a vehicle registered to Meridian Property Holdings, and had reached the conclusion that a trial would not go well for him. He received a suspended sentence of 18 months and a substantial fine, with a civil judgment entered against him for full restitution of legal costs and damages. He was required to dissolve Meridian Property Holdings, LLC. His real estate license was suspended pending review. It was not, by any measure, the full accounting that the crime deserved. I am old enough and have taught enough history and literature and the complicated stories of ordinary human lives to have no illusions about the gap between the justice that is theoretically possible and the justice that actually arrives. But his name was now on a court record, attached permanently and publicly to the truth of what he had done. Joanna Ferris would be able to point to it. Anyone who employed him, who trusted him, who was considering giving him access to their property or their assets, they would be able to find it, in the way that the internet makes the past findable in ways it never used to be. It was enough. Not everything, but enough. Claire and I had been talking every Sunday throughout the investigation. Not easily. There were Sundays where the call lasted only 15 minutes and neither of us found much to say, and we sat with the silence, rather than filling it artificially, because I had decided, and I think she had too, that false ease was worse than honest difficulty. She filed for divorce in February. She did not ask my opinion, which was the correct decision. It was her marriage and her life and her reckoning, and I had my own to manage, and she needed to make this choice without my presence as either endorsement or permission. She moved to a small flat in the center of Hartfield and began, carefully and without fanfare, the process of rebuilding. She started going to therapy, which she told me matter-of-factly one Sunday in April, with the tone of someone reporting a practical decision rather than seeking a reaction. I said, "Good." She said, "I should have done it years ago." I said, "Probably." We were quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I'm sorry I didn't say something to you about what he was planning. I keep going back to the moment. There were several moments when I could have." I said, "I know." She said, "I was afraid of him, a little," which I'm only now beginning to understand as a meaningful piece of information about what that marriage was. I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you think we'll be all right?" I said, "I think we'll be something. I'm not sure yet what kind of all right, but we'll be something." She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, a small, real, unperformed laugh. And she said, "That's very you, Mom." I said, "I know. I meant it as a compliment to both of us." I went back to Bellagio's in the spring. A Saturday afternoon in April, warm for the time of year, the light, the particular clear, pale gold that April makes sometimes when it is trying its best. I went for tea, not dinner, and I asked to be seated at the table by the window with the fountain, and I asked to speak to Marcus. He came out with the slight wariness of a young man who is not sure if he is about to be praised or reprimanded, and I told him at length what had happened. The whole of it, from the police arriving to the arrest to the guilty plea, and I thanked him properly. He said it was nothing, and I told him it was very far from nothing. I told him that one person paying attention, one person choosing not to look the other way when it would have been easier and safer and entirely understandable to look the other way, had changed everything. He looked slightly embarrassed by this, in the way that genuinely good people often do when they are thanked for being good, and I found that I liked him very much for it. I left a tip that was, I suspect, more than he expected, and I drove home on the April roads with the windows down and Harold's radio station on, and I felt something, not happiness exactly, which seemed too simple a word, but something in the family of happiness, in the neighborhood of it. And I let myself feel it without trying to contain or explain it. It is June now. The roses along the south fence are extraordinary this year. Harold would have been insufferably proud, the way he always was in the years when they were particularly good, and I tell him so sometimes in the early morning when I am working in the garden before the heat arrives, which is a habit I have had for 41 years and see no reason to change. The kitchen clock still ticks. The pencil marks are still on the doorframe. The ring mark is still on the table. The documents that were laid out on that table on a Tuesday evening in November are filed in Martin Holloway's cabinet, and 14 Maple Crest Drive is mine, unambiguously and legally, and with the specific solidity of a thing that has been tested and has held. Betty and I have tea on Tuesday afternoons, which we have done for 20 years, and will presumably continue to do until one of us is unable to. She does not say I told you so about Daniel, because Betty is not that kind of person. She says, more tea, which is better. There's a thing I know now that I did not know before the evening at Bellagio's, or rather a thing I knew abstractly but now know in the way that the body knows things. In the hands, in the chest, in the specific coldness that starts at the fingertips and moves inward. The most dangerous betrayal is not the one that comes from strangers. It comes from the table you set, the chair you pull out, the glass you fill, the person you hand the breadbasket to without looking, because you have done it so many times and so easily and with so much genuine warmth that it has become the furniture of your life, as familiar and as unexamined as the ring mark on Harold's table. That is the geography of trust, the places where you stop looking because you have decided, reasonably and lovingly, that there is nothing you need to see. I look now, not with suspicion, not with the armored vigilance of someone who has decided that the world is primarily hostile. That would be a different kind of theft, the theft of the ease that makes ordinary life livable. But I look. I pay attention to what people do as distinct from what they say. I pay attention to the questions that come back again and again to the same subject. I pay attention to the silences, to who is quiet and when and about what. This is not cynicism. This is the thing I learned sitting at Harold's table in November with my hands gone cold and a glass of wine I couldn't drink, while the clock ticked and the roses moved in the wind outside the window. That love and attention are not the same thing, and that the truest form of care for the people and places you love is to stay awake in their presence. The south fence roses are full this year, and pink and very strong. Harold would have said, in that dry, fond way he had, that they just needed time. He was right about most things. He was right about that.